Welcome to the Political Risk Podcast, where risk, insurance, and geopolitics mix. I'm your host, David Benyon. My guest is Charles Hecker, author of Zero Sum, The Arc of International Business in Russia. Charles spent 40 years travelling and working in the Soviet Union and Russia as a journalist and political risk consultant. In this episode, we discuss his highly acclaimed new book and draw some lessons from the highs and lows of doing business in post-Soviet Russia, from communism to capitalism to the exodus of 3 years ago. Some of those lessons might be transferable to a degree for doing business in other frontier countries that also require a robust risk appetite. This episode, like the book we're discussing, is extremely timely and should resonate deeply. Vladimir Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine is turning 3 years old. Fresh attempts will be made this year to try and bring about a negotiated settlement to end this bloody, unprovoked war of Russian aggression. Any potential for a compromised peace will be subject to huge risks and uncertainties, which lie beyond the scope of our conversation here. But there is time to talk about the future, from a business perspective during our discussion, including possible conditions for a return to Russia by Western firms. Should the geopolitical situation become transformed between Russia and the West, and should the current stark picture of legal and reputational obstacles become changed? I hope you'll enjoy this conversation. I certainly did. So firstly, Charles, welcome to the pod.
Dave, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's get down to business and let's talk about the book. So Zero Sum is already published in the UK and Europe at the end of November, and it'll be out in the US in March 2025. Congratulations. It's not just insightful, but it's also very well written.
Thank you, Dave. I mean, I was warned when I first sat down to write the book that writing a book can be a traumatic experience and that it's full of ups and downs and that you'll have a nervous breakdown, halfway through and that your footnotes will crash right before you submit the manuscript and that, there are all sorts of disaster lurks. I'm glad you enjoyed reading it because I enjoyed writing it a lot more than I expected and a lot more than I was told to anticipate.
It shows, and there are loads of wonderful examples in there that we'll get into as the conversation goes on. Let's sort of set the stage before we get any further then, because there's so many lessons within the book, and it paints a vivid picture of Russia's evolution and the plot arc of Western businesses in Russia from the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991 all the way up to the full-scale 2022 invasion of Ukraine. So if we look further back, let's go back to the early days of Russia being a land of opportunity. What are some of the key, imagining we don't have the hindsight of what happened in 2022, some of the key inflection points along the way, Russia going from a sort of mysterious frontier, new place to do business and becoming perhaps increasingly murky and complex as firms learn to operate there?
On the topic of hindsight, it's going to be a little bit difficult to dispose with hindsight completely because now we have, the luxury of looking back on all these days and all these years of international investment in Russia. But the book tries to dose hindsight very cautiously and carefully. And, the book is made up of dozens and dozens of interviews with executives and government officials and analysts and, players in the market over the years who also had the benefit of hindsight. But some of them saw certain things happen along the way and point those out and say that they were aware of them contemporaneously. And so, the very first thing was, the opening of the market in general. And observers at the time and people who went into the market very early paint a picture of incredible contrast. The country, Russia, emerging from the collapse of the Soviet Union, was in complete disarray. It was in disarray politically. It was in disarray economically. Law enforcement and the rule of law, such as it was, had completely collapsed. And yet, Russia presented a huge opportunity. And when you think about it that way, you think, well, hold on, you have a place that's virtually in ruins. Where's the opportunity? The opportunity came in the size of the potential market, the fact that we knew that Russian consumers had tons of money stuffed in their mattresses, that Russian industry would at some point need international capital goods to rebuild. But I guess most importantly is that the Soviet Union came unstuck creating Russia against the backdrop of globalization. When places like Russia, that we would have once thought to be too risky, too distant, too opaque, too dangerous, globalization was saying, hey, actually, those places are loaded with opportunity. So the first inflection point really is the very, very beginning and that contrast of risk and opportunity. I guess you could say that to encapsulate the 90s, the wild East and this general atmosphere of lawlessness and opportunity, there were a few signposts during that period. And I think that one of them is the loans for shares scandal, I guess you could call it, the loans for shares series of transactions. And this was a system by which some of Russia's emerging oligarchs, some of its most wealthy businessmen, loaned money to the Yeltsin administration and got shares in Russia's biggest and most important strategic industries in exchange. And that was meant to be a temporary arrangement that would be unwound. And it never was. And, we're simplifying a lot here for the sake of efficiency. But this was one of the moments that created an opaque environment of oligarchic capitalism in Russia and set the tone for the blend of politics and business, of public and private going forward. And this was, the landscape that international investors had to navigate and understand. Now, in some cases, you could completely avoid that landscape. You were doing business in areas that weren't part of strategic industries or oligarchic structures. But in other cases, you were. And so our sensitivity towards political risk, Russian domestic politics, and how it fit in with the international world was immediately sort of put on alert. Again, for those, who took the time to notice, who were observant, and who had a fairly subtle appreciation of what was happening on the ground. So I think that was one important point. The other, I think, was just electoral politics in Russia and the 1996 presidential election itself, which was opaque, very heavily influenced by money, very heavily influenced by the Yeltsin clan and its entourage. And, I think was the beginning of a history of corrupt presidential elections going forward. And, so there's also a very important political signal about how democracy was going to be managed in Russia. To fast forward very quickly, the Yeltsin-Putin transition was also a managed transition. Putin was selected, basically, by the Yeltsin court, if you will. So that there is an extremely opaque moment in Russian political history. And yeah, Putin was confirmed, you could say, by an election that was held shortly after he was appointed president by Yeltsin as he departed. And then I guess, over the 2000s, the biggest question was, who is Vladimir Putin and what is he all about and what should we expect from him? And he gave us some signposts along the way. And I guess the most important one among many is really that by, the mid 2000s, the first decade of the 2000s, more than 50% of Russian GDP was being generated by state-owned companies. And it really was the return of the state to Russian economics. And it was facilitated by nationalizations. If you look at what happened to Yukos, that was a major signal to Western investors about how Russia worked. It was the warnings to the oligarchs of the 1990s that their interests must now align with the state's strategic interests, otherwise their empires would be at risk. And really, the emergence, finally, I'll say just for the sake of brevity, it was the emergence of a political philosophy in Russia called the power vertical and managed democracy, which meant really that in Putin's Russia, power would not be derived from the voting public upward, but rather from the Kremlin downward. And that power didn't rest with the people, power rested with the political elite, and that they were going to call the shots going forward. And, now with the benefit of hindsight, if you look at that combination, an increasing role of the state, increasing political control, politically and economically, we might have understood the general sort of direction of travel a little bit earlier on than we did.
You describe making money in chaos as requiring a quite voracious risk appetite. Can you elaborate on what sets successful business apart in those kind of unpredictable conditions?
The most successful companies were the ones who had a uniform and unified understanding of their risk appetite. And the companies that had a strong appetite for risk, a robust appetite for risk, and understood that and could manage it internally were the ones who could navigate Russia the best. The opposite of that are companies that had one appetite for risk in their business development function or in their sales function, a high appetite for risk, but had a very low appetite for risk in their compliance function or in their legal function or in their security function. And those companies were sort of like, do you remember the sort of Dr. Dolittle push me, pull you, where they were sort of moving in two directions or trying to move in two directions at the same time? And, that's understandable because different job functions have different goals and different metrics for success, which is really important also. The way that they're paid and bonused inside their organizations depend on sometimes dramatically different metrics. But the companies that said, Russia's our cup of tea, we know it's chaotic, we know it's risky, but we're all going to pull in the same direction. We're going to do it at the same time. We're going to talk about these risks openly and from the very beginning of every potential transaction. And, we've got our eyes on a single agreed prize, whether that's a sort of a transaction or, market goals in general. Companies that knew their gut and knew their gut, when too much was too much, that knew that across the institution, I think those were companies that did quite well in Russia.
Let's move on to talking about the exodus, the 2022 impact of the full-scale 2022 invasion of Ukraine. And you write, maybe the end came gradually and then suddenly, which is a nice Hemingway echo. But it always does with hindsight, right? The abrupt exodus of companies from Russia after the 2022 invasion is striking. But which factors do you think, political, legal, economic, reputational, etc., most influenced decision-making processes for firms that were leaving the market?
I think the answer is really sort of all of the above. And if we put ourselves back in that moment briefly, the other consideration that is important about all of this is how few of us, and I say us, how few of us saw this coming. And so, in spite of the troop buildup, in spite of what Putin was saying, in spite of the shuttle diplomacy back and forth to Moscow, and the security guarantees that the West was giving Putin about NATO and about the relationship between the East and the West, how few analysts and organizations and observers really saw this coming in spite of the ample evidence on the ground, because none of us thought that Putin would be so irrational to make a move that appeared to be against his country's best interests. And that, of course, is the theory of the rational actor who always acts in his country's best interests. And so all of that aside, what it meant was that the political considerations, the financial considerations, the operational, the reputational considerations, all of our decisions about this had to be made in an awful hurry. The number of companies, Dave, that had crisis management plans ready to go in their top desk drawer or, right there on their servers was incredibly small. And the number of companies that were prepared for this in advance was really sort of vanishingly small. So for some companies, the trigger really was legal. And that was as sanctions began to build up, that is really a black and white situation. If your company, your business partners, your sectors are impacted by sanctions, it becomes illegal for you to do business in Russia and it's time to go. So there was that criterion. There were companies that were driven very much by reputational concerns and the optics. We don't want to do business with an aggressor nation. Our shareholders, our stakeholders, our employees are pressuring us internally and externally to get out. And again, we're a company that understands our risk appetite, time to go. And the companies that, again, under enormous time constraints and under enormous pressure, the companies that were able to make these decisions quickly were the ones that were able to exit Russia with the least damage. Let's put it that way. I don't want to say that we're able to exit smoothly or easily, but it got increasingly difficult with time. And one of the great examples of this are companies from Finland. If you look at the analysis of the nationality of companies that left, when they left, and how they left, some of the biggest early movers were companies that had been in Russia for years from Finland. And perhaps this isn't so surprising because this, of course, is a country that knows Russia extremely well. And they were the ones who did not suffer from boiling frog syndrome. They said, let's go now. And then there were companies that sort of took their time because perhaps Russia was a lucrative market for them, or the size of their operations there, the operational considerations made this really difficult. Their footprint was enormous across Russia, and that's hard to do. But again, these were companies with brand names that were extremely prominent, and those are the ones that also came under crushing reputational pressure and regulatory pressure. And ultimately, they left as well. And then finally, government, including in the UK and in the US and across sort of, broadly speaking, G7 and some G20 nations, they turned to some of their biggest companies and they said, you need to go. We don't want you there anymore. And so there was direct government pressure, and particularly in sort of strategic sectors, to get out. And, this incredible sort of salad of risks materialized instantly. Companies are not always the most efficient decision makers. And this was a vexingly complex decision to make. And so it took a while to balance all of these concerns to say, well, we have a big presence here. We might take a reputational hit, but does that mean we should carry on? All of these factors, Dave, came to play, simultaneously and instantly.
Let's talk about one of the great examples of a firm that had to leave very quickly. So Paul Melling's perspective, a deeply embedded firm like Baker McKenzie was forced out. So what lessons can businesses take from those sudden exits?
It was really nice to sit down with Paul, and we had a lengthy interview. And Paul is one of the most experienced lawyers and one of the most experienced business people working in Russia. And he started working there in the late 80s. And, Paul was not an expat. He was a person who lived in Russia. And Baker McKenzie and all of the professional services firms, all of the big law firms, all of the big four accounting firms, all left very early on. And I think that they had a sensitivity to the reputational aspect of what they were doing. And they were very quickly able to come to the decision reputationally that this was not their cup of tea. The other thing is that law firms were working for entities, and all of the professional services firms were working for entities that fell under sanctions. And so again, this is one of those situations where they had to go. And bear in mind also that a lot of professional services firms in Russia had government clients, and that work became off limits. And so when you look at this in the whole, I think the signals were there fairly quickly and fairly vividly that they had to leave. And there was a great exodus of professional services firms from Russia, although I should add that they exited in a fairly specific fashion, and that is that most of them essentially broke away or sold their Russian operations. And because some of these firms, all of these firms, I guess, were partnerships, they were able essentially to sell their Russian operations to their local partners.
So joint ventures, what was the typical ratio percentage ownership between the foreign entity and the domestic one?
In the case of joint ventures, it varied. And the joint venture model actually sort of became less popular, I think, as Russia strangely became a safer place to do business. I mean, remember, Dave, that towards the 20-teens, I guess I would say, maybe before Crimea, Russia was on the verge of becoming not quite commonplace, but a reasonably routine place to do business. And so companies were just opening their own subsidiaries there. The joint venture model was a sort of safety model in the early 1990s where it felt safer to have a Russian partner. But, the ownership structures varied. What happened in professional services firms over the years, particularly following the 2008 global financial crisis, was a gradual Russification of the partnerships. And that is that where, the PwCs and the Deloittes and the Ernst and Youngs of the world in Russia used to have very large numbers of foreign partners on the ground in Moscow. That became expensive after a while. And then also there was a cadre of Russian professionals who were educated and had experience, to the caliber of their Western peers. And so a lot of these companies had predominantly in their Russian operations, Russian partners running the Moscow offices or the St. Petersburg offices, or, further into the hinterlands. They had Russian partners running their businesses in Russia.
The time when I briefly was in Moscow is around 2013, I think it was. And yeah, a lot of those, in this case, insurance firms and reinsurance brokers that I was talking to, because I was at a Russian reinsurance renewals focused event, rendezvous conference, just across the square from the Lubyanka, the old Soviet secret police dungeon prison, right?
Right.
Daunting part of Moscow, but it was very ensconced. And, firms like Hanover Re and SCOR, big reinsurers, were all very present. And of course, they're not. They had to rapidly exit the market, suspend their underwriting, in the same way as professional services firms had to suddenly get out because they were working with soon to be or already sanctioned entities.
That's right. I mean, I think that, one of the primary sources of business, particularly, after the outbreak of the full-scale invasion, Western companies very badly wanted their professional services firms to stay in Russia. They needed their advice more than ever on how to navigate what was happening, legally, politically, financially, militarily, from a security perspective. They needed those eyes and ears on the ground more than ever. They're still able to get that advice, but they get that advice from outside Russia, from people who are experienced in doing business in Russia. And I should say, for the sake of, accuracy and fairness, is that if you are a professional services firm that is taking enormous caution to avoid sanctions, and it's not easy, it's extremely difficult and full of subtlety and nuance because sanctions involve a lot of gray. But if you can take care to avoid sanctions in Russia, you can still provide valid professional advice to the companies that are still there, to the companies that are still trying to get out, and to the companies who have exited.
Well, that's what I want to ask you next. The companies that are still there, the ones that have just stayed despite all the risks, Oreo cookies, for example, still there. What does it say about the balance for those firms, their competing concerns and priorities?
You mentioned the example of Oreo cookies, and there's a quote in the book from the CEO of Mondelez, the confectionery company that the Oreo brand sits under, who said, our shareholders don't really care about whether we're in Russia or not. And so, I think that sort of says it all. And that is that they came under no internal pressure from their shareholders. Whether you consider shareholders internal or external is, I guess, a question. But, these are people who own stakes in the company who said, we're okay if you stay. The other thing is that some companies said, look, we are not involved in business with the Russian government, that selling biscuits in supermarkets doesn't forward the cause of the war. That, too, is a disputable point because, of course, these companies are paying taxes to the Russian government. There were some companies that stayed because their business in Russia was small and they were able to fly under the radar.
I'd probably add one caveat to that. I think that the tax example is the material one. But the second one is that they add legitimacy to the Russian government. If you can still point and say that we have Western multinationals operating, it detracts from the vision of Russia as a pariah since it started operating as, depending on what you want to call it, a rogue state or a terrorist state, as Ukrainians would say.
Putin himself said, as the terms and conditions for exiting Russia became increasingly harsh and punitive, Putin himself said, for the companies that are staying here, stay. and do your business. And Putin said, God bless you, or some words to that effect. So there is a reputational concern about whether you can say that doing business in Russia is business as usual. What these companies typically said on top of the fact that they're staying was that they will not invest in Russia. They will not grow their business in Russia. They will not advertise in Russia. And so their sales and marketing and business development budgets were cut. Interestingly, that sort of made them more profitable in Russia. But they sort of said, we're staying, but we're not enthusiastic about it. So leave us alone, essentially. The interesting thing, Dave, is that as this goes on, and without getting ahead of the conversation, will these companies that stayed in Russia, will they at some point look like the smart ones? Well, perhaps we'll get to this when we talk about the future. But, for the companies that are private, for the companies that aren't subject to aggressive coverage, for the companies that aren't subject to aggressive regulatory pressures, for the companies that are under the radar, small, mid-market companies, they were able to stay because either their brand wasn't that prominent, their presence wasn't that prominent, and, people just don't really care about the folks who are making sort of pumps and valves, whereas people do care about the companies that are making cappuccinos and hamburgers.
Let's talk about some of the lessons learned or lessons ignored, because you mentioned that companies often forget to view countries as political entities. We're all guilty of this, talking about countries as emerging markets. And of course, they're not just markets, they are countries. So what lesson has the Russian country market taught global businesses about operating in complex environments, if we can sort of draw out broader global lessons from this?
Well, again, lessons are out there. The question is whether we study them and whether we take them to heart and whether we use them to avoid making the same mistake again. I think the main lesson, if there is one to extract, is that I'm not sure that companies regularly and aggressively questioned the assumptions that they were making about Russia. And you're right to say that, companies looked at Russia and lots of other places as markets instead of countries. And this is reflected in the language that companies use internally. We say things like EMEA, or we say Asia Pac, or we say LATAM, which completely glosses over the political entities that make up those acronyms.
The phrase that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and all these places have their own cultures. And words like emerging market strategies and EMEA, and these are all very generic and sound great when you're at corporate HQ in New York.
Exactly. And you're also very, very wise to point out the difference in perceptions and the risk that resides in the view of a country from a distant headquarter and the view of a country in a Moscow office. And bridging that gap and reconciling those two views was a major source of risk in the way companies did business in Russia. But, there are market indicators and there are political indicators that come out of every country. And I think that we focused primarily on market indicators coming out of Russia rather than on some of the political, what we might have thought of as sort of background noise or political static, background radiation, that very, very quickly came to the foreground in Russia. And we as companies, and I say we, as companies didn't always put our assumptions under enough scrutiny and pressure. And that could be the assumptions that we made about Russia all the way in the 1990s to the assumptions that we were making in Russia up until the full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
I wanted to just extend that question on then and say, obviously, the places in the world like China, do you think firms are beginning to reconsider their strategies within these kind of places?
Well, let's put it this way. Attractive markets will always attract investment, period. And that's fine. We should let companies to a certain degree off the hook to a certain extent by saying, look, this is the behavior that we expect from companies, and that companies that ignore market opportunities get punished. Risk and reward kind of go hand in hand. The higher the risk, the higher the reward. And so that's attractive to companies. What I will say is that most big international companies now understand that political and geopolitical risk has an impact that goes straight to the bottom line. and that it really can not just dent a company's reputation or its perception on the market, but it really can damage a company's ability to make and keep profits and to maintain its share price. And so geopolitics and that kind of risk, that suite of risks, used to be a sort of nice to have consideration. Oh, sort of good to understand, sort of what's the president been up to lately, or who's the prime minister seeing these days, and who's in and who's out. Instead of sort of keeping on top of that by reading the FT or the Economist periodically, people have to know this stuff extremely well now. And I think they understand that.
So moving to thinking about the future of business in Russia, the way back, is there a way back? What would it take for companies to return? And are there any early signs of businesses that, are thinking about re-entry?
So what's interesting, Dave, is that there are companies that were thinking about re-entry as they left. And so a lot of the professional services firms that we talked about.
Putin thought this was a 3-day war, special military operation. So nobody in 2022 expected we'd still be at war 3 years later.
Well, you're right. Actually, you know what? And so before we even talk about going back, we should acknowledge that very few people, in addition to the fact that very few of us really thought that things would go this way at all, I think even fewer of us thought that the war, as you and I are talking now, is approaching its 3rd year anniversary. This was something that was supposed to be over almost as quickly as it started. And so there were companies who were thinking about going back as they were leaving, because for the professional services firms that sold their Russia business to their Russian partners, a lot of those transactions included buyback clauses that had a sort of certain set of conditionalities and a certain time limit on them. And, I think we're still within that time limit. But because the war has gone on as long as it has, and because companies have been out for as long as they have been, I think it is legitimate to question the viability of some of these buyback agreements. There is a group of Russian business people now who are the owners of, it was a turnkey transfer. They took over well lubricated international business operations and, are now owners of viable businesses in Russia. You have to ask how willing they're going to be to turn those businesses back. And if they are, at what price? And that's just discussing, the professional services area. For the companies that were nationalized, or for companies that were sold under duress as part of their exit, those companies were sold, again, under enormous pressure and at huge knockdown values, were sold to Russia's new business elite. And you also have to wonder how willing those individuals will be to let go of assets they got through nationalization or through pressurized sales. So there's that to consider. And then we're back to the whole sort of legal, operational, reputational, and financial considerations. And the first thing that has to happen is that there has to be sanctions relief. President Trump was asked during the campaign, the most recent presidential campaign, he was asked at the New York Economic Forum what his view was on Russian sanctions and whether he was minded to modify them at all. And, Trump, in his typical Trumpian way, didn't really answer the question, but he said that he doesn't like sanctions in general as a diplomatic tool because he thinks it damages the position of the dollar in the United States in international trade. Companies are already thinking about going back. And there are companies for whom the release of sanctions will be the only trigger that matters to them. Once it becomes legally permissible to do business in Russia, they will go back. The reputational issues are more difficult to sort out. And one of the drivers of the reputational question will be what happens with the mood music about doing business in Russia. Don't forget that, yes, this was supposed to be a quick war, but since it's not, what Putin has been doing over the past 3 years is labeling the West as the enemy and as hostile nations. So how do you do a 180 from saying that the war in Ukraine is actually a war with the West and a war with a Western system of business and politics? How do you do a pivot from that to say all of a sudden, welcome back? Really, for there to be a sort of, and I will be proven wrong on this, I'm sure, but, for there to be a sort of full scale kind of kumbaya moment between Russia and the West again, I think that's going to take a very, very long time. That doesn't mean that we won't go back, but it means that the companies that do go back will be the ones, again, with this strong risk appetite and a pretty strong stomach lining. And they better have learned, the lessons that they got on the way out.
You've looked at shifts in talent and recruitment, and Russian expat employees, for example, they relocated in some cases along with the departing entity. The employees, Russian employees of Western firms in Russia, moved with them to other offices elsewhere in Europe, in London or other European cities, or in Dubai, places like that, when their firm withdrew from Russian operations. So how do you think these changes will affect the ability of foreign firms to operate within Russia? And what do you think the future means for those Russian expats?
This is a really, really important question that needs to be resolved. Russia suffered an enormous brain drain with the outbreak of the full-scale invasion. And some of Russia's best business minds left, both from inside international companies and even from inside Russian companies. They just left because they were the ones who said, this scenario is no longer to my liking. And these were the people who had either, the practical or the operational or the financial resources to leave. They had someplace to go. They could pay for it. Or they had relatives that they could live with. They had options, including, as you point out, sort of corporate transfers. And some of them have been gone for coming on 3 years now. And some of them have put down roots in new places and maybe will stay. Some of them have moved on from the companies that transferred them out of Russia. And, we'll have to see what their current employers think. And some of them will want to go back. So there are a few things that these people are talking about. And you hear this in conversation. And that is that there are some people who left Russia that will go back right away because they miss it. And they miss the place and they miss their family and their friends and their relatives and people who stayed there. And they feel that they will have options going back, economic options going back. There are others who say, you know what? Yeah, I miss it and I want to see my mom or my grandmother or, my old school friends who are still there. But they want to see more change in Russia, politically and socially and economically, before they go back. And, for Western companies, and I keep saying Western and I mean to say international, but really, this has sort of become an East-West question primarily. Western companies that go back will have to think, who will work for us if we reopen? How many of our former employees will either move back, or former employees who are still in Russia, how many of them will come back to work for us? Because you have to wonder, people learn lessons too. Do you want to go back and work for a foreign company that may at some point have to leave again? Or do you want to work for a company that, even if it stays, given all the baggage now that's been loaded onto the East-West geopolitical question, even if the sort of the background music improves, there has to be a lingering question about, do I want to work for the West?
And there's going to be interference, I imagine, government intelligence agencies, corporate espionage, wanting to have people informing within those organizations.
There's always been that. And, I guess the heightened level of concern about security on the return is just that, geopolitically, even beyond Russia, Ukraine, geopolitically, Dave, the world is just so full of disruption now. Again, as we speak, look what's happening in the Middle East. Look at what's happening with China, which is also a big player in and with Russia now. Dave, depending upon when you were last in Russia, depending upon what airport you arrived at, the highway that you take in from Sheremetyevo, which is, one of the main airports to the north of Moscow, and there's this big, fat, 12-lane highway into town. That highway was one of those roads that you see in lots of cities that was dotted on both sides with automobile dealerships, these gigantic sort of shiny showrooms that had Mercedes and BMW and the Toyota showrooms and the Nissan showrooms and all of that. People who still drive that road say that all of those showrooms now are full of Chinese brands, and the shiny cars on the showroom floors are from China. So think of the dislocation that will have to happen on the way back. And yeah, there are sort of Russian consumers who were very fond of their sort of caramel lattes and had Starbucks in the lobby of their office buildings. There is, Starbucks sold and left Russia. And so there's a place called Stars Coffee that sells caramel lattes.
I've heard of it, and the branding is deliberately looks almost the same.
Exactly right. It is a hair's breadth away from a trademark infringement. But anyway, this is just a way of painting, a fairly complex picture to going back. Getting people is one of the biggest concerns. Look, there are solutions to these things, but they're expensive. If you want to hire good talent, you're going to have to pay for it. There's a labor shortage in Russia right now at all levels of the economy. And that means that hiring qualified people is hard and costly. And so these are all considerations that companies are going to have to make as they go back in.
That's all for now, so please tune in next time. There'll be another episode out before the end of February. I've been your host, David Benyon, and I'd like to thank my guest, Charles Hecker. Production was by Peter McGill and Lawrence Durkin, made the music.